To this aspect of the question, the court must first analyze the concept of annexation. Second, the court examines Israel's policies and practices with a view to determining whether they amount to annexation. Finally, the court discusses the lawfulness of Israel's policies and practices. With regard to the concept of annexation, in the present context, the court understands that to mean the forcible acquisition by the occupying power of the territory that it occupies, namely its integration into the territory of the occupying power. Annexation then presupposes the intent of the occupying power to exercise permanent control over the occupied territory. The court records in this regard that under the law of occupation, the control of the occupied territory by the occupying power must be temporary in character. Consequently, conduct by the occupying power that displays an intent to exercise permanent control over the occupied territory may indicate an act of annexation. The assertion by the occupying power of permanent control of the occupied territory may manifest itself in a variety of ways. In this connection, the court notes that a distinction between de jure and de facto annexation is occasionally made. Although differing in terms of the means through which the annexation is carried out, both types of annexation share the same objective, the assertion of permanent control over the occupied territory. Against this background, the court must examine whether, through its conduct, Israel establishes its permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory in a manner that would amount to annexation. The court first examines Israel's policies and practices in relation to Jerusalem. It notes that Israel has applied its domestic law in East Jerusalem since its occupation in 1967. In 1980, Israel enacted domestic legislation in the form of a basic law proclaiming East Jerusalem as part of its capital. Israel has asserted that East Jerusalem is part of its territory, as evidenced by the notification of the Israeli government to the Secretary General of the United Nations, according to which, and I quote, Jerusalem is not in any part occupied territory, is the sovereign capital of the State of Israel. End of quote. The absentee property law of 1950 has facilitated the confiscation of absentee property and its use for the expansion of Israeli settlements in and around the historical borders of the city. It's reported that approximately 230,000 persons live in 14 settlements established in East Jerusalem. The court considers that Israel's measures in East Jerusalem create an inhospitable environment for the Palestinian population. Because Israel treats East Jerusalem as its own territory, it regards Palestinians residing there as foreigners, and it requires that they hold a valid residence permit. Israeli law has also put in place a building permit scheme, the violation of which results in demolition through an expedited procedure as well as steep fines. According to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Israel's process of land ownership registration is pursued in areas of Israeli settlement expansion, which would increase Israeli control over additional territory in East Jerusalem. Turning to Israel's settlement policy in the West Bank, the court observed that pursuant to the basic law of 2018, the State of Israel, I quote, views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and shall act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation, end of quote. The displacement of the local population from the occupied territory, which sustains Israel's settlement policy, also advances the integration of the territory. Israeli policies and practices induce the departure of the Palestinian population from parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, notably from East Jerusalem and Area C in the West Bank. This in turn enables the further expansion of Israel's settlement policy and the ready integration of Palestinian territory into Israel. The court also recalls that Israel's practice of exploitation of the natural resources in the West Bank is inconsistent with the right of the Palestinian people to permanent sovereignty over natural resources. Israel's extension of its domestic law to the West Bank, notably to the settlements and over settlers, as well as its assumption of broader regularity powers by virtue of the prolonged character of the occupation, entrenches its control over the occupied territory. Policies, practices, and other measures that are such as to bring the occupied territory into the occupying powers' permanent control constitute acts of annexation. Having examined Israel's policies and practices, both in relation to East Jerusalem and to the West Bank, with a view to determining whether they amount to annexation, the Court comes to the conclusion that Israel's policies and practices, including the maintenance and expansion of settlements, the construction of associated infrastructure and the wall, the exploitation of natural resources, the proclamation of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the comprehensive application of Israeli domestic law in East Jerusalem, and its extensive application in the West Bank, entrench Israel's control of the occupied Palestinian territory, notably of East Jerusalem and of Area C of the West Bank. These policies and practices are designed to maintain in place indefinitely, to remain in place indefinitely and to create irreversible effects on the ground. Consequently, the Court considered that these policies and practices amount to annexation of large parts of the occupied Palestinian territory. It is the view of the Court that to seek to acquire sovereignty over an occupied territory, as shown by the policies and practices adopted by Israel in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, is contrary to the prohibition of the use of force in international relations and its corollary principle of the non-acquisition of territory by force. The manner in which the annexation affects the legal status of the occupation and thereby the legality of the continued presence of Israel is discussed later in the advisory opinion. The Court then examined the question of discriminatory legislation and measures. Assembly are discriminatory. In this regard, the Court first considers that it has to limit its analysis to legislation and measures that are closely linked to the policies and practices discussed previously. Second, the question covers Israel's legislation and measures only to the extent that they apply in the occupied Palestinian territory. Third, the question is confined to the potentially discriminatory character of Israel's legislation and measures. Having thus defined the scope of question A, the Court turned to the concept of discrimination. It considers that common to all of the relevant provisions of international law is the concept of differential treatment between persons belonging to different groups. It observed in this connection that the existence of the Palestinian people is not at issue. Therefore, in the Court's view, differential treatment of Palestinians can give rise to discrimination. In order to answer question A, the Court first examines the effects that Israel's residence permit policy in East Jerusalem has on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. The Court then turned to the restrictions imposed by Israel on the movement of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. Finally, it examines Israel's practice of demolition of Palestinian properties in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, both with regard to the practice of punitive demolition and demolitions for lack of a building permit. The Court notes that in that connection, that it's reported that almost 11,000 Palestinian structures have been demolished since 2009. The Court concludes from the evidence presented to it and on the basis of its analysis that a broad array of legislation adopted and measures taken by Israel in its capacity as an occupying power treat Palestinians differently on grounds specified by international law. The Court notes that this differentiation of treatment cannot be justified with reference to reasonable and objective criteria, nor to a legitimate public aim. Accordingly, the Court is of the view that the regime of comprehensive restrictions imposed by Israel on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory constitutes systematic discrimination based on inter alia, race, religion, or ethnic origin in violation of Article 2, Paragraph 1 and 26 of the ICCPR, Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the ICESCR, and Article 2 of CERD. A number of participants have argued that Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory amount to segregation or apartheid in breach of Article 3 of CERD. Article 3 of CERD provides as follows, I quote, "States parties particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertake to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction." This provision refers to two particularly severe forms of racial discrimination, racial segregation, and apartheid. The Court observed that Israel's legislation and measures impose and serve to maintain a near-complete separation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem between the settler and Palestinian communities. For this reason, the Court considered that Israel's legislation and measures constitute a breach of Article 3 of CERD. Having found that Israel's settlement policy, its acts of annexation, and its related discriminatory legislation and measures are in breach of international law, the Court turned to the aspect of Question A that inquires as to the effects of Israel's policies and practices on the exercise of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. The Court has already affirmed in its sworn opinion the existence of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. In the present proceedings, the Court first determines the scope of this right and then examines the effects, if any, that Israel's policies and practices have on its exercise. In light of its analysis, the Court is of the view that the prolonged character of Israel's unlawful policies and practices aggravates the violation of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. As a consequence of Israel's policies and practices which span decades, the Palestinian people has been deprived of its right to self-determination over a long period, and further prolongation of these policies and practices undermines the exercise of this right in the future. For these reasons, the Court is of the view that Israel's unlawful policies and practices are in breach of Israel's obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The manner in which these policies affect the legal status of the occupation and thereby the legality of the continued presence of Israel in the occupied territory is discussed later. Je vais donner lecture de la suite.
I shall now continue reading the rest of the opinion in French. The Court then turns to the first part of Question B, on which the General Assembly requested its opinion, and examines whether, and if so, the manner in which, the policies and practices of Israel have affected the legal status of the occupation in light of the relevant rules and principles of international law. It begins by further determining the scope of the first part of Question B posed by the General Assembly. In this regard, the Court considers that the first part of Question B posed by the General Assembly is not whether the policies and practices of Israel affect the legal status of the occupation as such. Rather, the Court is of the view that the scope of the first part of the second question concerns the manner in which Israel's policies and practices affect the legal status of the occupation, and thereby the legality of the continued presence of Israel as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory. This legality is to be determined under the rules and principles of general international law, including those of the Charter of the United Nations. The Court has determined that Israeli policies and practices and the manner in which they are implemented and applied on the ground have significant effects on the legal status of the occupation through the extension of Israeli sovereignty to certain parts of the occupied territory, their gradual annexation to Israeli territory, the exercise of Israeli governmental functions and the application of its domestic laws therein, as well as through the transfer of a growing number of its own nationals to those parts of the territory and impeding the exercise of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. The Court is of the view that Israel's assertion of sovereignty and its annexation of certain parts of the territory constitute a violation of the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force. This violation has a direct impact on the legality of Israel's continued presence as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory. The Court considers that Israel is not entitled to sovereignty over or to exercise sovereign powers in any part of the occupied Palestinian territory on account of its occupation. Nor can Israel's security concerns override the principle of the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force. The Court further observes that the effects of Israel's policies and practices discussed earlier, and its exercise of sovereignty over certain parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly the West Bank and East Jerusalem, constitute an obstruction to the exercise by the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination. The effects of these policies and practices include Israel's annexation of parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, the fragmentation of this territory undermining its integrity, the deprivation of the Palestinian people of the enjoyment of the natural resources of the territory, and its impairment of the Palestinian people's right to pursue its economic, social, and cultural development. The above described effects of Israel's policies and practices, resulting inter alia in the prolonged deprivation of the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination, constitute a breach of this fundamental right. This breach has a direct impact on the legality of Israel's presence as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory. The Court is of the view that occupation cannot be used in such a manner as to leave indefinitely the occupied population in a state of suspension and uncertainty, denying them the right to self-determination while integrating parts of their territory into the occupying power's own territory. The Court considers that the existence of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination cannot be subject to conditions on the part of the occupying power, in view of its character as an inalienable right. In light of the foregoing, the Court turns to the examination of the legality of the continued presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. The Court considers that the violations by Israel of the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force and of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination have a direct impact on the legality of the continued presence of Israel as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory. The sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law, and renders Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful. This illegality relates to the entirety of the Palestinian territory occupied by Israel in 1967. This is the territorial unit across which Israel has imposed policies and practices to fragment and frustrate the ability of the Palestinian people to exercise its right to self-determination, and over large swathes of which it has extended Israeli sovereignty in violation of international law. The entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory is also the territory in relation to which the Palestinian people should be able to exercise its right to self-determination, the integrity of which must be respected. Responding to an argument made by a few participants, the court observes that the Oslo Accords do not permit Israel to annex parts of the occupied Palestinian territory in order to meet its security needs, nor do they authorize Israel to maintain a permanent presence in the occupied Palestinian territory for such security needs. The court emphasizes that the conclusion that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegal does not release it from its obligations and responsibilities under international law, particularly the law of occupation, obligations and responsibilities towards the Palestinian population and towards other states in respect of the exercise of its powers in relation to the territory until such time as its presence is brought to an end. It is the effective control of a territory, regardless of its legal status under international law, which determines the basis of the responsibility of a state for its acts affecting the population of the territory or other states. The court has found that Israel's policies and practices referred to in question A are in breach of international law. The maintenance of these policies and practices is an unlawful act of a continuing character entailing Israel's international responsibility. The court has also found, in reply to the first part of question B, that the continued presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegal. The court therefore addresses the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices referred to in question A for Israel, together with those arising from the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory under question B for Israel, for other states, and for the United Nations. With regard to the court's finding that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegal, the court considers that such presence constitutes a wrongful act entailing its international responsibility. It is a wrongful act of a continuing character which has been brought about by Israel's violations through its policies and practices of the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force and the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. Consequently, Israel has an obligation to bring an end to its presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. The court further observes that, with respect to the policies and practices of Israel referred to in question A, which were found to be unlawful, Israel has an obligation to put an end to those unlawful acts. In this respect, Israel must immediately cease all new settlement activity. Israel also has an obligation to repeal all legislation and measures creating or maintaining the unlawful situation, including those which discriminate against the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as all measures aimed at modifying the demographic composition of any parts of the territory. Israel is also under an obligation to provide full reparation for the damage caused by its internationally wrongful acts to all natural or legal persons concerned. Reparation includes restitution, compensation, and/or satisfaction. Restitution includes Israel's obligation to return the land and other immovable property, as well as all assets seized from any natural or legal person since its occupation started in 1967, and all cultural property and assets taken from Palestinians and Palestinian institutions, including archives and documents. It also requires the evacuation of all settlers from existing settlements and the dismantling of the parts of the wall constructed by Israel that are situated in the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as allowing all Palestinians displaced during the occupation to return to their original place of residence. In the event that such restitution should prove to be materially impossible, Israel has an obligation to compensate, in accordance with the applicable rules of international law, all natural or legal persons and populations, where that may be the case, having suffered any form of material damage as a result of Israel's wrongful acts under the occupation. The Court emphasised that the obligations flowing from Israel's internationally wrongful acts do not release it from its continuing duty to perform the international obligations which its conduct is in breach of. Specifically, Israel remains bound to comply with its obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and its obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The Court then turns to the legal consequences of Israel's internationally wrongful acts in the occupied Palestinian territory as regards other states. The Court observes that the obligations violated by Israel include certain obligations erga omnes, among which are the obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the obligation arising from the prohibition of the use of force to acquire territory, as well as certain of its obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. With regard to the right to self-determination, the Court considers that, while it is for the General Assembly and the Security Council to pronounce on the modalities required to ensure an end to Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and the full realization of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, all states must cooperate with the United Nations to put these modalities into effect. As regards the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force, taking note of the resolutions of the Security Council and General Assembly, the Court is of the view that Member States are under an obligation not to recognise any changes in the physical character or demographic composition, institutional structure, or status of the territory occupied by Israel on the 5th of June 1967, including Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, except as agreed by the parties to the conflict through negotiations, and to distinguish in their dealings with Israel between the territory of the State of Israel and the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Moreover, the Court considers that, in view of the character and importance of the rights and obligations involved, all states are under an obligation not to recognise as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. They are also under an obligation not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. It is for all states, while respecting the Charter of the United Nations and international law, to ensure that any impediment resulting from the illegal presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory to the exercise of the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination is brought to an end. In addition, all the states parties to the Fourth Geneva Convention have the obligation, while respecting the Charter of the United Nations and international law, to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law as embodied in that convention. The duty of non-recognition specified earlier also applies to international organisations, including the United Nations, in view of the serious breaches of obligations erga omnes under international law. The obligation not to recognise as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and the obligation to distinguish in dealings with Israel between the territory of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory apply also to the United Nations. Finally, the Court is of the view that the precise modalities to bring to an end Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is a matter to be dealt with by the General Assembly, which requested this opinion, as well as the Security Council. Therefore, it is for the General Assembly and the Security Council to consider what further action is required to put an end to the illegal presence of Israel, taking into account the present advisory opinion. The Court considers it important to stress, as it did in its Wall advisory opinion, I quote, "the urgent necessity for the United Nations as a whole to redouble its efforts to bring the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which continues to pose a threat to international peace and security, to a speedy conclusion, thereby establishing a just and lasting peace in the region." End of quote. The Court also considers that the realization of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, including its right to an independent and sovereign state, living side by side in peace with the State of Israel, within secure and recognized borders for both states, as envisaged in resolutions of the Security Council and General Assembly, would contribute to regional stability and the security of all states in the Middle East. The Court emphasizes that its reply to the questions put to it by the General Assembly rests on the totality of the legal grounds set forth by the Court above, each of which is to be read in the light of the others, taking into account the framing by the Court of the material, territorial and temporal scope of the questions.
I'll now read in English paragraph 285, which contains the operative clause of the opinion. For these reasons, the Court, 1, unanimously finds that it has jurisdiction to give the advisory opinion requested. 2, by 14 votes to 1, decides to comply with the request for an advisory opinion. In favor, President Salam, Judges Tamka, Abraham, Yusuf, Shway, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Chargeworth, Brown, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Oresco, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde. By 11 votes to 4, is of the opinion that the State of Israel's continued presence in the occupied territory is unlawful. In favor, President Salam, Judges Yusuf, Shway, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Chargeworth, Brandt, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, Judges Tamka, Abraham, Uresco. By 11 votes to 4, is of the opinion that the State of Israel is under an obligation to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. In favor, President Salam, Judges Yusuf, Shway, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Chargeworth, Brandt, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, Judges Tamka, Abraham, Uresco. By 14 votes to 1, is of the opinion that the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. In favor, President Salam, Judges Tamka, Abraham, Yusuf, Shway, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Chargeworth, Brandt, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Uresco, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde. By 14 votes to 1, is of the opinion that the State of Israel has the obligation to make reparation for the damage caused to all natural or legal persons concerned in the occupied Palestinian territory. In favor, President Salam, judges Tamka, Abraham, Yusuf, Shwe, Mandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez Robledo, Cleveland, Juresco, Tladi. Against, Vice President Subotinde. By 12 votes to 3, is of the opinion that all states are under an obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. In favor, President Salam, judges Tomka, Yusuf, Shwe, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez Robledo, Cleveland, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, judges Abraham, Juresco. By 12 votes to 3, is of the opinion that international organizations, including the United Nations, are under an obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. In favor, President Salam, judges Tamka, Yusuf, Shwe, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez Robledo, Cleveland, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, judges Abraham, Juresco. By 12 votes to 3, is of the opinion that the United Nations, and especially the General Assembly, which requested this opinion, and the Security Council should consider the precise modalities and further action required to bring to an end as rapidly as possible the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. In favor, President Salam, judges Tamka, Yusuf, Shwe, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez Robledo, Cleveland, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, judges Abraham, Juresco. I shall now call upon the registrar to read the operative part of the opinion in French. Monsieur le Greffier.
Mr. Registrar. For these reasons, the Court, 1. Unanimously finds that it has jurisdiction to give the advisory opinion requested. 2. By 14 votes to 1, decides to comply with the request for an advisory opinion. In favour, Mr. Salam, President, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Yusuf, Ms. Shwe, Bandari, Mr. Wasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez Robledo, Cleveland, Orescu, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde. 3. By 11 votes to 4, is of the opinion that the State of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful. In favour, President Salam, Judges Yusuf, Shwe, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez Robledo, Cleveland, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Orescu. 4. By 11 votes to 4, is of the opinion that the State of Israel is under an obligation to bring an end to its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. In favour, President Salam, Judges Yusuf, Shwe, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez Robledo, Cleveland, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Orescu. 5. By 14 votes to 1, is of the opinion that the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. In favour, President Salam, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Yusuf, Shui, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Orescu, Clady. Against, Vice President Sebutinde. 6. By 14 votes to 1, is of the opinion that the State of Israel has the obligation to make reparation for the damage caused to all natural or legal persons concerned in the occupied Palestinian territory. In favour, President Salam, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Yusuf, Shui, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Orescu, Clady. Against, Vice President Sebutinde. 7. By 12 votes to 3, is of the opinion that all states are under an obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. In favour, President Salam, Judges Tomka, Yusuf, Shui, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Clady. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, Judges Abraham, Orescu. 8. By 12 votes to 3, is of the opinion that international organizations, including the United Nations, are under an obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. In favour, President Salam, Judges Tomka, Yusuf, Shui, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Clady, of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. In favour, President Salam, Judges Tomka, Yusuf, Shui, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Charlesworth, Brandt, Gomez-Robledo, Cleveland, Clady. Against, Vice President Sebutinde, Judges Abraham, Orescu.
Je vous remercie. President Salam appends a declaration to the advisory opinion of the court. Vice President Sebutinde appends a dissenting opinion to the advisory opinion of the court. Judge Tomka appends a declaration to the advisory opinion of the court. Judges Tomka, Abraham, and Orescu append a joint opinion to the advisory opinion of the court. Judge Yusuf appends a separate opinion to the advisory opinion of the court. Judge Shui appends a declaration to the advisory opinion of the court. Judges Iwasawa and Nolte append separate opinions to the advisory opinion of the court. Judges Nolte and Cleveland append a joint declaration to the advisory opinion of the court. Judges Charlesworth and Brandt append declarations to the advisory opinion of the court. Judges Gomez-Robledo and Cleveland append separate opinions to the advisory opinion of the court. Judge Clady appends a declaration to the advisory opinion of the court. The text of the opinion is available from today in TypeScript. It will also be available almost immediately on the court's internet site. The printed text will be available in the near future. As the court has no other business before it, I declare the sitting closed.